The black figure on the highway nearly cost me my life. I never expected that one night could change my life forever, but it did. I'm a truck driver in Australia. Have been for over 15 years, and if there's one thing I've learned in all that time, it's that the open road can mess with your head. You see things, hear things, and after enough sleepless nights on endless stretches of empty highway, you start to question what's real and what's not. Most of the time, it's just fatigue playing tricks on your mind, but sometimes it's something else entirely. This story isn't something I share often. Hell, I've tried to forget it ever happened. But after years of keeping it bottled up, I figure it's time to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Maybe someone will believe me. Because as unbelievable as it sounds, every word of this is true. It all started on a routine drive along the Stuart Highway. For those of you who don't know, the Stuart Highway is one of the most desolate, isolated stretches of road in Australia, cutting through the heart of the outback. If you're not used to it, the drive can be unnerving, just miles and miles of open land, with nothing but the occasional roadhouse to break up the monotony. But for me, it was just another day on the job. I was hauling a load from Darwin to Adelaide, a journey I'd done dozens of times before. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was about halfway through the trip. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow everything around you. My headlights were the only source of light for miles, casting long, narrow beams onto the asphalt ahead. Everything was going smoothly until I hit a particularly empty stretch of road. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal. In Australia, it's not uncommon to see kangaroos or wild cattle crossing the highway at night. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person, or at least, it looked like a person. Standing dead center in the middle of the road, about 100 meters ahead, was a figure. A tall, black silhouette, completely motionless. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no clothes, just a shadowy outline against the headlights. Instinctively, I hit the brakes. My tires screeched against the asphalt as I brought the truck to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, if you could call it staring. I couldn't see any eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unsettling, like it was boring straight into me. For a few seconds, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. My brain was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? Some kind of prank? But who the hell would be standing in the middle of the highway at this time of night? In the middle of nowhere? I blinked, and then, just like that, the figure was gone. 1 second it was there. The next it wasn't. No movement. No fading into the distance. It just vanished. I sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe I'd been driving too long without a break. Maybe I was just tired, but something about it didn't feel right. It hadn't been a blur in my peripheral vision or a momentary hallucination. It had been real, solid. I had seen it. Clear as day, standing there in the middle of the road. After a few deep breaths, I convinced myself to keep driving. I had a schedule to keep, and I didn't want to lose time sitting in the middle of the highway, spooked by something that probably wasn't even real. So I hit the gas and continued down the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. I kept glancing in my rearview mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, watching as I drove away. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the endless expanse of the outback. About 30 minutes later, I was starting to calm down. The rational part of my brain had taken over, convincing me that it had all been in my head. I'd been driving for hours. I was tired, and my mind had played a trick on me. It wasn't the first time I'd seen strange things on the road. Fatigue can do that to you. But just as I was starting to relax, it happened again. I was coming around a bend in the highway when, out of nowhere, the figure appeared. This time, it was right in front of the truck, standing on the hood. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the truck skidded, the tires screeching as the massive vehicle came to an abrupt halt. My heart was in my throat. And for a moment, All I could do was stare in disbelief at the figure now perched on the front of the truck. It was the same black silhouette, tall, featureless, and completely motionless. Its hands were pressed against the windshield, and I could feel its gaze again. That same cold, piercing stare that made my skin crawl. There were no eyes, no face, but I could feel it watching me, studying me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me through the glass. Then, just like before, it vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, disappearing into thin air without a trace. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I sat there in the driver's seat, drenched in sweat, my mind racing. This wasn't just fatigue. This wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. I had seen it twice now, and I had no explanation for what the hell it was. All I knew was that I needed to get off the road. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere with other people, and fast. I checked my GPS. There was a small roadhouse about 50 kilometers ahead, the next sign of civilization. I made the decision to push through, but my hands were still shaking as I gripped the wheel, and my foot hovered nervously over the gas pedal, ready to slam the brakes at the first sign of anything unusual. The rest of the drive was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every shadow on the road, every flicker of movement in the darkness made my heart skip a beat. I was hyper-aware of everything around me, my eyes darting to the mirrors and the side windows, convinced that the figure would appear again. But it didn't. At least, not yet. When I finally pulled into the roadhouse, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely shift the truck into park. The small building was a beacon of light in the otherwise endless darkness, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I saw other vehicles parked outside. I wasn't alone anymore. I got out of the truck and headed inside, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The place was mostly empty, save for a few late-night travelers grabbing a bite to eat. I made my way to the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, my hands still trembling as I handed the cashier a crumpled bill. "Long drive?" the cashier asked, her voice casual. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic, but the truth was, I felt like one. How could I explain what I'd seen? A black figure standing in the middle of the highway, then appearing on the hood of my truck? It sounded insane, even to me. As I sat down with my coffee, I overheard a couple of other truck drivers talking at a nearby table. They were swapping stories about strange things they'd seen on the road, phantom hitchhikers, ghostly figures, and other unexplained encounters. My ears perked up, and I found myself eavesdropping on their conversation. One of the drivers, a grizzled old man with a thick beard, was telling the other about an experience he'd had years ago. He had been driving through the outback late at night when he saw something standing in the middle of the road. He described it as a shadow, a tall, black silhouette, just like the one I had seen. My blood ran cold. He went on to say that the figure had appeared in front of his truck, just like it had with me, and when he tried to swerve to avoid it, his truck went off the road, crashing into the ditch. He'd barely made it out alive. "It's the black shadow," the old driver said, his voice low and serious. "Lots of drivers have seen it out here. They say it's some kind of spirit, a warning, maybe, but whatever it is, it's bad news. If you see it, you're in for trouble." I sat there, staring into my coffee, my mind reeling. The black shadow. So I wasn't the only one who had seen it. But what was it? A spirit? A hallucination? Or something worse? I wanted to ask the driver more, but by the time I worked up the courage, he had already left the roadhouse. I finished my coffee in silence, trying to process what I had just heard. Maybe it was just a legend, a story passed down among truck drivers to explain the strange things people see when they're driving for hours on end. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. I had seen the figure with my own eyes, twice, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just a hallucination. After a few hours of rest, I decided to get back on the road. I was still rattled, but I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to fall behind schedule. I told myself that if I saw the figure again, I'd stop and try to get a better look, to see if I could figure out what it really was. But the next few hours passed without incident. The highway stretched out before me, empty and quiet, and for a brief moment, I started to believe that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the old driver was right. Maybe it was just a legend, a story to scare rookies like me. But then it happened again. I was about 100 kilometers from my destination when I saw the figure for the third time. This time, it was standing at the side of the road, just barely visible in the periphery of my headlights. My heart leaped into my throat as I slowed the truck to a crawl. My eyes locked on the shadowy figure. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching me as I approached. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I pulled the truck over to the side of the road, coming to a stop just a few meters away from where the figure stood. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, and stepped out of the truck. The air was cold, unnaturally cold for the outback at night, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, even though it had no face, just a dark, featureless silhouette against the night sky. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The figure remained still, its presence oppressive, suffocating. I took a step closer, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it, just for a split second. But it was enough to send a jolt of terror through my entire body. In the beam of my flashlight, the figure's shape shifted, warping and twisting like a shadow coming to life, its limbs elongated, its form stretching unnaturally. And I could see it, feel it moving toward me, though it never actually stepped forward. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I don't know how I made it back to the truck, but the next thing I remember, I was slamming the door shut and hitting the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away. The figure didn't follow me, but the fear did. I don't remember much about the rest of the drive. By the time I reached my destination, I was shaking so badly that I could barely walk. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, and all I could think about was the figure, the way it had moved, the way it had watched me, like it was waiting for something. I ended up in the hospital later that night. The doctors said it was exhaustion, maybe even a mild panic attack brought on by stress. But I knew better. It wasn't stress that had put me in that hospital bed. It was something else, something dark and malevolent that had followed me on that lonely stretch of highway. The doctors told me to take some time off work, to rest and recover, but I knew that no amount of rest would fix what had happened. The black figure had left a mark on me, a mark that I couldn't erase, no matter how hard I tried. I haven't driven the Stewart Highway since that night. Hell, I don't think I'll ever drive through the outback again. There are some things out there, things that defy explanation, things that don't belong in our world. And whatever that figure was, it wasn't human. I still have nightmares sometimes. I'll wake up in a cold sweat. The image of the figure burned into my mind, its dark, featureless form looming over me. But every time I wake up, I remind myself that I survived. I made it out. And for that, I'm grateful. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the black figure on the highway. And I'll never stop wondering what it wanted from me.